Reason journalist Robby Soave has been writing about culture, free speech, due process, and moral outrage on campus since joining the magazine in 2014.
Do you need to get out?
That year, he was one of the first reporters to question the veracity of a Rolling Stone article that accused several fraternity brothers of a horrific gang rape at the University of Virginia, a story the magazine later retracted because of insufficient evidence. Earlier this year, when a clip of MAGA-hat-wearing high school students appearing to intimidate a Native American man went viral, Soave was one of the first journalists to carefully scrutinize the raw video, discovering that the interaction was more complicated than the outrage mob had claimed. Major media organizations later looped back to acknowledge that they had erred in their reporting.
I don't blame the kids.
So many people admitted they made snap judgments before these other facts came in.
The 30-year-old Soave has just published his first book, Panic Attack: Young Radicals in the Age of Trump, which examines the ascendancy of what he calls the intersectional left and the identitarian right among young political activists. I talked with Soave about his experience reporting and writing the book, today's political climate on campus, and why he thinks college activists' emphasis on identity is misplaced. So, Robby, what is Panic Attack about?
Panic Attack is about problems that I've noticed on college campuses for the last couple of years, threats to free speech, due process, and other values of classical liberals that are often coming from the left, from students who would describe themselves as progressives, even though progressives would have supported many of these things like free speech and due process. But now the students who call themselves progressive are shutting down speakers who they disagree with or who make someone on campus feel uncomfortable, are calling for policies that have made it harder for people accused of misconduct to get a fair trial, have done things that threaten certain liberal principles on campus. And obviously they would like to export these practices to not just to other campuses, but also to the country at large, to the firm, to social media companies, which are now making decisions like this for what kind of content is okay. So it's interviews with student activists, people who march in the street in DC, Berkeley, other places who want social change, and interviews with them about why they like these tactics and where their ideas come from.
And these activists that you're examining are mostly on what you call the intersectional left, although there's also an examination of the identitarian right near the end of the book. As a libertarian, what is your interest in exploring these ideologies?
Sure. I mean, I was just so interested by, over the last few years, the changes I saw taking place. You know, it used to be that someone who's very progressive has like an ACLU approach to free speech, that, you know, even if it's a crazy, hateful person shouting something, during military service members' funeral, like that's the Westboro Baptist Supreme Court case, that we were going to defend their right to do so. And that was such an ironclad progressive value. But we have seen increasingly over the last couple of years things like Charles Murray coming to speak at a number of universities, and he's being shouted down by not all students, not most students, but a small number of activists who think that him being allowed to speak, it's not just that they disagree with him, but it's that his words cause emotional harm to certain people on campus, and that is a form of violence. And thus it's not only justified, but necessary to protect people from the harm that his words cause. That was such a kind of new thing. I mean, shutting down speakers is not new, but doing it for an explicit sort of safetyism was a trend that I saw developing. So I became very interested in talking to the students about why they like that strategy or think that strategy is so important.
A lot of the policies that we've seen play out on college campuses, things like trigger warnings or microaggression databases, safe spaces, all the stuff you hear about are couched in that language of safety and words as violence or causing physical harm. I mean, where does that idea come from? Were you able to discover like where what the genesis of that was?
So first, it's important to realize that this immense bureaucracy has grown on campuses over the last couple dozen years to now adjudicate these claims, to now provide monitoring and reporting services. There's administrators who are paid very handsomely. There's tons of them. Their salaries and ranks have increased in the ways the faculties have not, again, over the last 30 years or so. So now there's this this bureaucracy to treat these concerns very seriously. They've also learned these concerns, I think, a little bit from a philosophy that I describe in the book as intersectionality, which is something that came about in the 1980s out of sociology. This idea that there are different kinds of oppression. There's racism, there's sexism, anti-gay animus, on and on and on. But they're related, but they're separate, and they stack. And you have to be against all of them. It's not enough to just fight one of these things. And that's become more influential for progressives. So now on campus, where, again, we're talking about relatively privileged people, there's actually campus in the literal physical safety sense is safe than many other places. In fact, even the sexual assault problem, women of the same age as students who are not actually on campuses are in greater danger of sexual assault than female students. So the problems are not necessarily, I think, as large as many make them out to be. But but these grievances are there, and they have a bureaucracy that's dealing with them, and they have a philosophy that all these things must be confronted at once. And no matter the big things from like racism and sexism to what pronouns you're being addressed with, or do you have things like of that nature. And if you're not fighting all of them, you are not in good standing in the progressive community. So that's driving a lot of this. Yes, we must oppose, obviously, fascism and Trump, but we also must oppose whoever else comes to speak. And we will also fight even the ACLU if they come here because they support free speech rights, which is what happened at William and Mary within the last 2 years. They actually, the progressives protested a speaker with the ACLU because they rejected the idea that free speech is a value that's on their side.
Well, so if intersectionality is the ideology, you describe it as kind of stacking. So you might be a woman, but also Latina and also gay, and those three things add up to a higher level of oppression. The logic does seem to make some sense. I mean, these are all different marginalized groups, so it seems like compounding that would create possibly more problems, more oppression for a given individual. So what's your critique of intersectionality, and where do you think it actually gets things right?
Right. So I think it's true, as you just said. So I agree with it. The theory. Obviously, these are sources of real oppression in society. And Kimberly Crenshaw, who is the sociologist who came up with it, she was trying to say that she wanted activists to not just fight racism without fighting sexism. That was like her goal. So again, the theory is fine as a tactical sort of framework for bringing about social change. I have some concerns about it and how it's being applied in particular. Again, it's all well and good to fight sexism and racism, but as we've added, again, more and more and more grievances, I mean, many Americans, you can get them to show up maybe to a march to fight, to the Women's March, for instance, because of Trump's appalling record on women, because people are fired up against anti-sexism. But the activists I talked to, again, the far-left progressive activists, they said the Women's March was no good. They deliberately avoided it because it wasn't intersectional. By that, they meant the people in charge of it were not trans women of color. They were not people who satisfied multiple marginalized statuses. So my point of view is, if you're going to require that every sort of activist thing you do or every attempt at social change, checks off all of these boxes, you're going to have a hard time doing anything because you who believe that all these boxes must be checked off are few. Where all of Americans, some might hold progressive views on race and sex issues. Maybe they're not for gay marriage, or they are for gay marriage, but they support Israel and the Israel-Palestine conflict. Or something. There's all these kinds of different. People are different. You can't have a single issue coalition if you require everyone to agree on every single further, more fringe thing a leftist progressive wants. And it's produced, my book is a chronicle of oftentimes hilarious infighting based on these issues. The DSA, the Democratic Socialists of America, they put out sort of a plan for a Medicare for all type thing, and that drew criticism from their disability working group, because the disabilities issue, people said, how dare you come out with this charge without having consulted us, who are the marginalized group most affected by this. We should have been leading the charge. Only we have authority to lead this issue, and there was infighting, which was kind of ridiculous. But that's where a militant adherence to intersectionality gets you.
And you see conservatives observing this with a sort of glee because it's the left eating its own from their perspective. It provides moments of amusement for libertarians as well. But I mean, what is your attitude towards seeing this all play out on the left? Is it something that we should just kind of sit back and let it happen, or what are your concerns, if any?
Yeah, I think I write this exactly in the book, that part of the reason I'm so interested in where the left's going wrong is that occasionally I would like them to succeed. Criminal justice issues are one thing I talk about in the book. I have a chapter on sort of the Black Lives Matter group, which I think the effect that Black Lives Matter has had on the country and on policy is still being written. I think we absolutely don't know for sure. And it's a big group, and it's had positive impacts in some places and probably negative impacts other places. It's confusing because Trump is himself, runs on this very law and order, anti-criminal justice kind of platform, and then has one conversation with Kim Kardashian and Kanye West, and is now suddenly interested in sentencing reform. Yeah. But so my concern about something like the intersectional and the very identity approach of Black Lives Matter, for instance, they made this about the impact of these issues on a specific racial group, and I worry that made it less appealing to to getting more Americans on board with it. If I'm trying to get older conservatives on board with criminal justice reform, I'm not going to say, like, you're complicit in racism if you don't agree with me. I'm going to talk about how this just costs too much money, and even police say you can't keep drugs out of jail, for goodness sake. You're going to talk about those things. The intersectional approach is saying, no, we have to talk about how this is most horrible for this group of people, and so on and so forth. Making it identity-based because people in the country hate identity politics, I think can turn people off. And so that's my concern.
Soave says the intersectional left has inadvertently empowered its mirror image, the alt-right, members of which clashed with protesters in Charlottesville, Virginia in 2017. At that event, one man ran over and killed a protester with his car.
We're in a very bad moment in our politics for the kind of ideas that I like, for classical liberalism or individual libertarianism on both sides. I mean, I'm criticizing the left for kind of abandoning some of these individual liberty values that I hold in so much esteem. But of course, the right is going in the same but opposite direction. It is more tribal, is more populist, is more nationalist. There's a debate going on right now in conservative pundit circles about further retreating from sort of a slightly libertarian framework into a more explicitly almost theocratic direction. And this is happening, everywhere. This is happening in Europe. This is even further advanced in Europe between a kind of far left progressive socialist paradigm and a very nationalist conservative paradigm. If these two extremes, they butt heads, and then both feel more justified in going more the other direction. That's something I talk about. The people who start on the alt-right pathway are just making fun of leftists to begin with, or they're making fun of leftist political correctness overreach, and then they're saying horrible things just to trigger people on the left, and then they're coming to actually believe these horrible things, and it's justifying their behavior. And the same thing happens the other way too. So I am criticizing from a perspective of I would like to move both these groups back to having something of appreciation for values that in not so distant times they had more interest in.
And yeah, so you do cover the alt-right in the book, or the identitarian right. What is the relationship there that you see between the intersectional left and the identitarian right? How are they feeding off of each other?
Sure. Yeah, I wanted to survey, young activist groups that have arisen in the Trump era, and the alt-right, while still a small fringe group, that I think maybe had its high water mark for in terms of how many people and how much we were talking about them at Charlottesville a few years ago. And hopefully that's the high water mark for them. I think we would all be happier to never hear from them again. But they see themselves as a reaction to some degree to the left, as an explicit or a co-opting of identity politics, but for white people. I mean, this is how Richard Spencer described his movement when I interviewed him for the book. He said, I mean, he wants things like a welfare state, but for white people. He says it's good to derive meaning from your membership in a racial category, which again, this is the exact sort of opposite way I think meaning derives from. Meaning derives from you being an individual, and we all, as individuals, have rights, and it's not because you are preordained into some racial group. But that's how this very fringe far-right movement sees themselves. And, you know, and it's not fair, I think, to blame, obviously, the violence and the bad things the right has done is not somehow the left's fault. It's the fault of the people who did it, without any question. But these fringe groups do feed on each other. I mean, they fight each other online all the time. You know, they see I think people adjacent to the alt-right and maybe interested to some degree in alt-right ideas feel like, man, those people are right. Look, this person, you know, who isn't even alt-right, they got kicked out of campus or kicked off social media or whatever. They're being censored. So then the kind of conspiracy people seem right all along to them.
When provocateur Milo Yiannopoulos accepted the invitation of a conservative student group to speak at UC Berkeley, the campus erupted. Masked protesters associated with the leftist group Antifa threw Molotov cocktails at the police and tossed barricades through windows to protest Yiannopoulos' presence. When Reason visited campus a year later, students were ambivalent about what had occurred.
The speech can be considered violence. Inviting people like Milo Yiannopoulos creates an unsafe environment for the people that he is speaking against.
What do people say is the proper role of political violence within these movements?
Yeah, certainly we've seen violence in all these places. Portland as well has a lot of Antifa activity going on. Certainly the activists we're talking about, and again, this is not most people, this is not most students, I'm talking about a small number of activists, but they absolutely see political violence as legitimate. I mean, Antifa is an organization with a history going back to Europe in the 1930s, I mean, the anti-fascists. And they, Mark Bray, who's written a book called the Antifa Handbook about the movement, you know, makes it explicit that they are not a liberal movement. They do not believe in free speech. They believe in free speech if it's being harnessed by Antifa, but they're not about defending the rights of people whose political motives they disagree with. So they're not saying, I don't think that we're always and automatically going to use violence, but there's nothing, violence is not off the table for them. They are certainly prepared to use violence in situations. And I mean, I saw this in the research I was doing for the book. I saw some violence at Michigan when I saw Charles Murray speak. I saw some at Berkeley when I visited. I saw some at Columbia when they had a controversial far-right speaker come to speak. And again, you know, there's no one in there. There were few people in the audience. This person was giving remarks in like a basement. It was fine. There's nothing very important happening there. And you go, okay, I don't know what the big deal was. And then you go outside and there's just, you know, there are dozens and dozens and dozens of people in masks and black hoods, and they're attacking each other, and they're talking about how we like need to overthrow the entire university and we like all of Western capitalism or something. And it's just, and it's like really fringe, crazy stuff. It was just this one guy speaking. You could have ignored him, and that would have been probably, you know, he's probably wants the protesters there to feel like he had some effect. If you just ignore some of these people, that would be a better tactic than what Antifa and even the other protesters do in so many of these cases.
Yeah, I'm curious about all of this as spectacle, because you talk about these incidents with Charles Murray, or we mentioned Milo Yiannopoulos, and these get widespread media coverage when they happen. But some people have argued that that's disproportionate to the actual problem, that this is a pretty small group of people and it's not really widespread on college campuses, for instance. How widespread a problem is it in your estimation?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth to that argument. Certainly these things are overcovered in a way that make them seem like they're getting worse. I mean, you know, if you're a student and you wrote some kind of bad or easily mocked progressive article for your student newspaper, you know, when I was in college in the aughts, you would have written it, you might have been mocked on campus, but then that would have been it. It would have been forgotten. Now you might have, you know, it could be a cable news segment about it. So there's a way that these problems are maybe blown up. It's very difficult to quantify, qualify what we're talking about. I mean, it's the case that probably most universities, especially if we're talking community colleges as well, smaller schools that are not as much under the national spotlight, they'll have speakers come and there's no big deal. You know, this is a bigger problem at better known, loftier institutions, your Harvards, your Yales, Oberlin, Reed, prestigious liberal arts colleges, somewhat to some degree the UC system. So I'm always cautious because I don't want to overstate the problem. I don't want to scare people. That's the opposite of what I'm trying to do. And again, most students are not like this. And I don't even think the number of students who do these kinds of things has increased. I just think it's still the same small number of students. They're just started getting their way from like 2012 and on, a bit more than they did before. There was a reluctance among the rest of the people on campus to challenge them when they stand up and they shout down whoever it is. There was more willingness on their part to do so, and there was less willingness on the part of others to condemn them. I mean, professors on campuses who are very far left, but again, in a more sort of ACLU mold, they are afraid to criticize these students. They're afraid to teach these students things they might not agree with. I mean, that's an important change. And I've talked to a lot of professors for this book and off the record who, again, are progressive people who are just terrified of their students. I think that is a big problem. I don't want to say that's every classroom or, you know, the whole system is about to come crashing down. But it is a problem if, you know, even some subset of professors are not teaching the law relating to sexual assault anymore, which is something that's happening, because they're afraid of triggering someone's trauma in the classroom. And you'll have fewer lawyers who are educated about the nuances of the law as pertaining to this subject. I mean, Harvard just, they did this. They fired a faculty dean who, Ron Sullivan, who is an expert on criminal justice reform, who advised President Obama, or when he was Senator Obama, who has helped free wrongfully incarcerated people, who has represented accused terrorists and accused murderers, because that's what you do if you believe in due process. But he had joined Harvey Weinstein's legal team. And some of the 50 student activists said, campus is unsafe for women because you did that. And Harvard listened and they fired the person. I think that's pretty terrible, even if we're talking about a handful of incidents rather than a broad trend. I still think that's pretty bad.
Yeah, you're seeing them actually cave to the demands where you're saying in the past it was more likely to be this loud, small contingent, possibly just ignored mostly. The most dramatic example I can think of is what played out at Evergreen College with Brett Weinstein, where you see an entire group of students swarming the head of the college, and he's basically sitting there taking it. I think they even tell him to shut up and sit down at one point. And they have them like barricaded in a library.
They essentially hold him hostage. It's kind of crazy stuff.
Yeah. So what changed there? Is it this administrative apparatus that is enabling this, or is it just the tide has turned and the power dynamics have switched somewhat?
I think the power dynamics switched somewhat, I think for a couple reasons. I mean, one of them is if we're talking specifically about activism relating to sexual misconduct on campus, the Title IX change, so Title IX is the statute that forbids gender-based discrimination in all schools that receive federal fundings. There was a change to that statute. I mean, not technically, the statute remained the same, but how it was interpreted by the Obama administration in 2011, they broadened what they considered sexual discrimination to be kind of all sexual misconduct. And they said the definition for whether this would be reasonable or is basically, you know, in the eyes of the beholder. So universities got really spooked that if they didn't very vigorously police sexual misconduct, they could be losing federal funding. So this has a speech component because, again, as I was saying about professors teaching the law as it relates to sexual assault, if you make someone in your class feel uncomfortable for a sex or gender-based reason, well, now there's this bureaucracy saying you've possibly violated federal law and you could put the entire university at risk for funding. So there's a lot of self-censoring. There was a lot of, and professors who stood up to this, like Laura Kipnis is someone who I know you've interviewed or Reason has interviewed, about this ordeal she went through when she wrote an essay criticizing Title IX, essentially, and her students filed a complaint against her for having written this essay, and she was investigated. Again, this is just like throwing academic freedom, the First Amendment, a climate of free expression on campus, all of that going out the window to comply with this overly broad interpretation of a statute. I mean, there are activists who got that numeral 9 tattooed to their ankles because it was that important to their activism. So that's an example of actually an explicit government policy change having a big impact. It took I think maybe like 2 or 3 years for activists to really understand that we have this tool now for going after people for these reasons. And that is the one thing that has actually changed since I finished the book. The Education Secretary, Betsy DeVos, rescinded that new definition, I think much to her credit. So you will have sort of less craziness around that, although the people they hired, the Title IX coordinators on campus, to still kind of follow those rules, they're still there. You know, mission creep and bureaucracies expand, and do they contract even when they get told you don't have to do this anymore? I don't know.
Yeah, and this topic is one of the cultural hot buttons right now, and people who talk about it and write about it are often viewed with suspicion, and sometimes rightly so, because there's a whole version of this where it's just people trying to make college students look stupid to score points for their political side. I don't think your book is that. I think it's a sincere attempt, like you were saying, to improve the tactics of the left to succeed in areas that we as libertarians would want to see them succeed. But what would your advice be to people who are talking about this and trying to do it in that smart, more nuanced way without falling into the more parody version of this? Absolutely. I think it's so important to call out the right as well when they are threatening free speech. Even on college campuses, they are. There are Republican legislators trying to pass bills that are even sometimes designed as free speech bills, but would actually just make it sort of hard to protest. I mean, the students can protest the speakers. They should protest the speakers. They just can't shut them down or exercise violence against them. But there is speech relating to sort of pro-Palestinian speech on campuses is often something that conservatives have said, well, we're going to kind of crush this. So I try to defend, a professor's right to not write a letter of recommendation for someone who wants to study abroad in Israel. That was something that happened at Michigan. That's a free speech issue. They're a freedom of association issue. So I think it's just so important to make sure we're calling out both sides. I don't think conservatives, I don't think Trump is especially a big defender of freedom of speech, even if he maybe says things I occasionally agree with about speech on campuses particularly. So it's just, he wants to expand libel laws. He's said that. So I think some of the criticisms coming at people who fixate on campus free speech issues is sometimes there are people who make it look like that's the only thing going on, and if we got rid of political correctness, everything would be great. Our only mission is to stop this sort of campus social justice warrior. So I'm here saying campus social justice warriors occasionally doing some bad stuff that we should be aware of. This is not made up. This is a real story. But there are a lot of other stories too about speech and about other things where the people in authority are people who are hurting the free speech rights of the left as well. This is my plea to activists, that if we empower authorities to quash free speech, whose speech
are they coming for first? I mean, there's going to be anti-war speech is going to be offensive or triggering for members of the military community. Criminal justice reform is going to be speech that impugns our cops.
Yeah, we've already seen the Blue Lives Matter meme, so that's one example of that.
Exactly,
Yeah.
it's exactly things like that. So I'm just here saying we got to defend a broad sort of free speech, classical liberal principles, and we have to defend them from the left, but certainly from the right as well.
So if you're arguing that intersectionality is ultimately self-defeating and empowering people like on the alt-right and to some degree Trump himself, what would a course correction look like in your mind? Like what, I guess, is kind of a best case scenario to move beyond this?
I would like to see some of the performative intersectionality dialed down, particularly on social media. Like there have been efforts lately undertaken by sort of far left young adult book reviewers to destroy every young adult novel that has something they perceive as problematic in it, even if it's not really problematic when you look at it. Like, I mean, there was a book written, this is a fantasy book about kind of the Anastasia myth in Russia, but like with magic and vampires and things like that.
Yeah.
But the criticism was, and it's an Asian author, but there's slavery in the book. And the criticism was, well, slavery is something that happened in the American South. How dare you culturally appropriate this story of slavery? Of course, slavery is something that has happened everywhere, including in Russia. So it's ridiculous.
Yeah.
But they got this author to cancel this book, despite having gotten a $500,000 advance. Now she's publishing it, but she's changed all the problematic parts, something like that. Anyway, this kind of just purely performative, burn the witch, cancel culture that is animated by intersectionality and a sort of militant paying attention to small grievances is having negative effects on our culture, I think. Having it on the firm, I mean, your companies are going to take less sort of creative or culturally interesting moves if you have to satisfy these just very unreasonable woke demands. So I'm trying to explain why I do think that's bad and self-defeating, and it drives the right. I mean, this animates so much criticism of progressivism when some of progressivism is good, and I would agree with it. So I would like them to dial back the kind of all the going overboard you do, not necessarily because of the theory, but the theory has helped push them in that direction.
What do you hope the libertarian-leaning people learn from reading this book?
I think the most important point I want to hammer home is that there's this idea that professors are sort of like brainwashing students or something, and the academy is evil because like education itself is evil or something like that. I don't quite think that's what's been going on here. I think most of these students who have learned tactics we don't like are actually learning them from each other. I think the faculty could be our allies in this kind of struggle. I mean, when they talk to me, they're very concerned about these things because they're the ones who are going to get in trouble. So I would like to see a dialing down of the rhetoric on how like professors are brainwashing their students or something like that, because I don't think that's quite the case. And many professors, even though we don't agree with them on everything, do represent or do have respect for individual liberty in some cases, and might have respect for individual liberty in even more cases if we come to their defense and we're their protectors here rather than we want to dismiss them because we think this is their fault.
So if it's not their fault, where is it coming from? Because there is the theory that this is all, cultural Marxism being taught by the professors. So is it something more structural? Is it back to that administrative bloat?
The administrative bloat is certainly part of the story, but I think the students are really just learning it from each other. Because of the way social media is, and they're in Facebook groups, and they can learn, activists at one college can see what activists at another have done. They're sharing quotes from famous sort of activist figures of yore. They're seeing what worked at other colleges. There are some academic disciplines where this is taught a little bit, and it's really more activism being taught than anything approaching scholarship. That's a kind of small part of academia.
So if they're learning from each other, then this is, in a way, technological, because it seems like you're saying it's social media, essentially, that is at least accelerating.
Well, technology makes it very easy for people across wide geographic distances to cluster around causes or ideas. I mean, the alt-right, this is not this is a good thing as well. Technology allows us to connect to like-minded people and identify them and interact with them, and it's broadly a good thing.
Sure.
But something like the alt-right would not have been possible before this because, you can have a small number of racist people spread out all over the country, and they would think they were alone, and they would never express their views out of fear of social stigma. Now they can find each other, and they can create kind of enclaves for them to express their ideas.
Well, if the technological change was part of the problem, or at least an accelerant to the problem, can it be part of the solution? Is there any way to leverage technology to course correct in some way?
Yeah, it's a difficult question, and it's one that technology companies are really grappling with themselves right now, because they're trying to decide how much policing of this content should we do? If we do it, do we look hypocritical when we don't get rid of all problematic content? I mean, it's impossible to do. These are giant networks, and who have made, sort of implicit free speech. We're platforms. So this is kind of like the public square. This is something Facebook has said.
Yeah.
This is a place where we're not going to police you for what you say. But it turns out in the public square, you can say really awful, vile things, and that's okay. That's constitutional. That's protected under the First Amendment. Are we really giving that much license? Now they're saying, well, wait a minute, maybe we didn't intend to do that. And I actually tend to think heavy-handed attempts to ban the bad people just will not work, or make the platform look very hypocritical and actually just make people angrier, or even drive this further underground. But the companies can do what they want. I'm not one of those libertarians who has suddenly decided, or not libertarian, anti-social justice warrior people who has suddenly decided that government intervention into this sector is not only justified but absolutely necessary. My principles were ready to collapse that easily, which is something, unfortunately, I see many other people who talk about these issues have suddenly decided Facebook should be broken up by the government because it was mean to some conservative once, which is pretty frustrating.
Yeah. How has your experience writing and researching this book affected your view of American politics and where things might be headed next?
It's interesting. Certainly over the course of time that I was writing this book, politics became even more polarized. Part of the issue is that Trump has made the media his enemy, is the rival team, and the media plays into it to some degree, partly because they're just doing their job of criticizing Trump. Others take it a bit farther than that, but they are the opposition team. So they're not like the mediators in a dispute between Democrats and Republicans. That used to be their old position. Republicans complained they were too affiliated with Democrats. But now it's like Trump versus media.
Yeah.
So everything that happens, and because Trump owns the news cycle and there's nothing that can happen that does not relate to Trump in some way, there's this need to fit it into that lens of Trump versus media. So like when the Covington, the kids on the Lincoln Memorial, that's something I wrote a lot about, saying that the media had gotten the story wrong. But I'm not saying that because I'm like defending Trump. But they tried to, people seeing me writing about it are like, well, are you on the side of the media, or are you saying Trump is good and right? I was saying neither of those things. But it's hard. It's become harder to be a person who's talking about issues, who sometimes thinks the media is right, sometimes thinks the characterization is correct, sometimes defends Trump, and just be not in either of those sides.
Yeah, there's the constant, which tribe are you in?
It just doesn't make sense to people anymore that you wouldn't be in one or the other.
Yeah. How do you get around that? How do you get out of that situation?
Well, you can't get out of the situation.
Yeah.
The hard part is making sure then you don't put one foot in one camp, because you're being pushed to get into one of those camps.
Right.
As a libertarian, I don't want to be in either of those camps. I don't think libertarians should want to be in either of those camps. We should, maintain our ability to make situational alliances, but to call out, big government and violations of our values wherever they occur. But the nature of the political conversation is really trying to push you in one direction. So you're just standing on a platform in the sea, trying not to fall into the waves or something.
Yeah, and do you think that sea is just going to continue to get choppier, or is there any hope of, calmer waters in the future?
Unfortunately, I don't see any reason why there would be calmer waters, at least in the immediate future. If Trump were to lose the election, maybe we'll have a different paradigm. It could very well be that this continues because you'll replace Trump with something else and it will be the exact same dynamic, or we won't replace him at all. Who knows? Certainly the kind of call out, cancel-y stuff I talk about is going to get worse as more, I think, activist type people move from campus into the workplace.
Yeah.
And again, it's not most young people, but it only needs one at a major media institution or a social media company who is changing the culture from within by saying that if you're doing this or you're doing that, it violates harassment law. It's a form of you're traumatizing me. You're making the workplace unsafe. This is why Kevin Williamson can't work at The Atlantic, because he holds views that made some people on staff. It wasn't literally that they disagree with his views. This is a conservative writer for The Atlantic, briefly for a week. It was his views made certain employees feel unsafe. So that kind of, again, that's different than disagreement. That's taking it to a level that we're going to see happen, I worry, in firm or in situation after situation, that's going to really change America over the next 10 years.
Okay, well, we've got choppier waters ahead. Hold on to your flotation devices. Robby, thank you very much for talking to us.
My pleasure.